When an otherwise healthy young man died mysteriously in his sleep, investigators assumed the suicide note explained why. It told a tale of heartbreak, deception, and jealousy. But it told an expert in forensic linguistics something entirely different. Early one morning in 1992, an emergency medical team responded to a call from a Raleigh, North Carolina apartment. There, they discovered a young man unconscious in bed. A closer look revealed he was dead.
This man had no evidence of head trauma, chest trauma, any other injury that might explain why he was dead. He was otherwise seemingly a healthy young man.
The victim was 23-year-old Michael Hunter, a recent college graduate with a successful career as a computer programmer. His roommate told police he found Michael unconscious when he tried to wake him up to go to work. The emergency medical team report stated that he appeared to have gone to sleep and never woke up.
When I found out Michael had died, that was very devastating. He was just my sunshine, because we had been through a lot together, Michael and I. And so when I found that out, I didn't know how I could go on.
The official autopsy was conducted 2 days later.
The initial examination revealed no intrinsic medical condition that would explain his death and no evidence of any injuries that might have any bearing on his death.
At that point, a conversation was made with the chief medical examiner for the state of North Carolina. It was determined that perhaps there should be some additional toxicology studies done.
Toxicology tests of the victim's blood told a different story. Michael had traces of 2 different cold medicines in his system, diphenhydramine and hydroxyzine. He also had a lethal dose of lidocaine.
This is a substance that is injected. This is not a substance that you take over the counter. You know, you hear about people accidentally taking ant poison or children accidentally taking medications. This is not.
Lidocaine is an anesthetic and is sometimes used in emergency medical situations to stabilize heartbeat.
Works very rapidly, such that those irregular heartbeats can become normal again very quickly, even before you arrive at the hospital, for example, if you're in an ambulance.
But there was a problem. The emergency personnel were certain that they did not inject anything into Michael in their resuscitation efforts.
They said that they did not administer any lidocaine because Michael was gone and they knew that there was no need to try to do that.
So I would find it very unusual for there to be lidocaine in the system of someone that was not under attempted for resuscitation.
Investigators wondered how lidocaine entered Michael's system. Then Michael's family learned about their son's secret, a secret that started to bring everything into focus. Michael Hunter's death devastated his family. And it wasn't until his funeral that his parents learned the secret their son had been hiding, the truth about Michael's sexual orientation.
I had no idea. I guess I was real naive or something, but I had no idea that Michael was gay.
Sadly, these revelations on top of Michael's death proved too great for his father, Jim.
He could not accept the fact that somebody could kill his son and then he could do nothing about it. And so this just put him in a depression that he could not and did not come out of. And he killed himself.
And now, Michael's mother mourned the loss of both the son and the husband.
It was just devastating, but because of the support, I mean, we just pulled together, and that's the support is what got us through.
Michael had two roommates, Gary Walston, a landscape architect, and 26-year-old Joseph Menino.
He was a medical student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, had completed his 4th year of medical school, but had not yet taken the licensing exam in North Carolina to be licensed as a physician.
Well, it was an unconventional relationship because I think in any sense of a relationship, there are typically only two people involved. And having a third person involved, I think, brought in a dynamic that was very different and maybe in some ways very exciting, but it also created problems that I don't think any of us would have anticipated.
In almost every sense of the word, the three roommates considered themselves to be life partners.
All three men had a homosexual love triangle, as they described it. They actually exchanged rings and promised to remain faithful to each other, and that was their living arrangement.
But it wasn't long before problems developed among the three. The main problem was that Michael Hunter hadn't been getting along with Joseph Menino.
Mike and Joe started not getting along with each other, which was difficult for me because I didn't have a problem with either one of them.
Eventually, Gary and Michael decided Joseph Menino had to go.
We told Joe basically that he was going to have to move out. That was, I think, like a week before Mike was killed.
Previously, all three shared the same bed. Now, Joseph Menino was relegated to sleep on the living room sofa until he found another place to live.
Gary and Michael had formed a duo that they did not want Joe involved in, and so things basically fell apart, and Joe found himself the odd man out.
Since Gary was out of town when Michael died, Joe Menino became the prime suspect. As a medical student, Menino would have had easy access to lidocaine, and he certainly knew how to give an injection. Investigators wondered whether the breakup of the love triangle might have given him a reason to kill.
No one knows what happened in the apartment that night except Joe Menino and Michael Hunter, and Michael's dead, so he can't tell us.
When questioned, Joe Menino gave police an unexpected piece of information. He admitted that on the night Michael died, he had given him an injection of antihistamines for his migraine headache. Antihistamines are an accepted but not common treatment for migraine pain. These were the same drugs found in the toxicological test.
He says that I did give him a shot to relax him. I didn't give him any other shots. I asked him directly, did he give him a shot of lidocaine? He said no.
Maybe he did have a migraine. I don't know. And Joe did give him something to put him to sleep, make him sleep sounder.
It was a violation of medical ethics, as well as North Carolina law, for a medical student to administer drugs without a licensed doctor present. This admission immediately put Menino's career at risk.
He would have completely thrown away his efforts to become a doctor. He would never have been licensed.
And investigators discovered another possible clue. A typed letter on a computer disk among Michael Hunter's things.
I started reading them, and they were what can best be described as drafts of suicide letters.
The letter, allegedly written by Michael before his death, said that he suspected that he was HIV positive and was going to kill himself.
I will use some medications I found in Joe's black bag. Please, don't blame him. Forgive me.
All investigators had to do now was confirm that Michael Hunter had actually written the letter. And for that, they turned to forensic linguistics. Suspicions about Michael Hunter's death grew even darker when a suicide note surfaced. It was unsigned, found on a floppy disk among Michael's belongings. Investigators wanted to confirm that Michael had indeed written the note and turned to Dr. Carol Chasky, an expert in the field of forensic linguistics.
Here was a document which was purely electronic. It was simply a computer file left on a diskette. There was nothing physical in the sense of ink or handwriting or paper that was available. It was almost, in a sense, pure language.
Linguistics is not so much the study of what a person says, but how they say it. How people combine words to make phrases and sentences is known as syntax.
I think what makes individuals' use of language distinctive is the pattern of simple and complex phrases which one individual uses versus the pattern of simple versus complex that another individual uses.
Dr. Chasky was given known writing samples from Michael Hunter and asked to compare them with the suicide note. Using a new computer program called Alias, or Automated Linguistic Identification of Authorship System, Dr. Chasky reduced each document to its most basic component, the individual words. The program then rebuilt each phrase from scratch and analyzed how the words were used in relation to each other.
We can get the frequencies of how many simple versus how many complex phrases of each type, noun, verb, adjective, and so forth, are in a document.
In the suicide note, Dr. Chasky found a distinctive use of conjunctions, words like and or but. These were used not to combine phrases, but used in large sentences.
That pattern is the conjoining for sentences and not for smaller things.
The note also contained a distinctive use of adverbs. Instead of using just one adverb, the writer had a habit of combining them. This pattern was not found in Michael's known writing samples.
So given this situation of how the statistical results turned out, I can conclude that Michael Hunter definitely did not write those suicide notes.
She then analyzed known writing samples from Joe Menino.
In the suicide notes, we see more complicated adverbs than simple ones. And that's the pattern that we find in Joseph Menino's writing, more complicated adverbs than simple ones. The suicide notes were not written by Michael Hunter, and most likely were written by Joseph Menino. I think the family could conclude that not only were the suicide notes phony and concocted, but that the claims within them were also spurious.
Michael's family never believed their son committed suicide.
I knew Michael didn't write the letters. I knew Michael didn't commit suicide. And so I was very thankful for the linguistic forensics for proving what I knew all along, that Michael did not write it.
I think the letters were probably one of the first real red lights for me that said, you know, none of this is making sense anymore.
The theory that Michael Hunter killed himself was further discredited when a blood test revealed he was not HIV positive. In addition, the amount of lidocaine in Michael's body would have incapacitated him within seconds and would have killed him within 2 minutes. This made the possibility of suicide even more unlikely.
This is not a take a handful of pills, lay down on the bed, wait 30 or 45 minutes for an effect type of drug. This is a very rapid onset, so it would be very unusual for someone to have enough time to clean up, if you will, after this type of injection.
The needle would have remained in his arm. And if for some reason it didn't, it would have fallen to the floor.
No needle was ever found in Michael Hunter's bedroom. When confronted with the forensic linguistics, Joe Menino changed his story. He admitted writing the suicide note. And he also said that Michael had complained of a migraine headache the night before he died, so he injected him with lidocaine to ease the pain. Menino claimed the overdose was an accident.
Joe was very calm. He would be talking to you and then cry for a second, and then he'd talk to you again, which is very suspicious to me. If I was mourning over somebody, I'd be mourning the whole time, not just in spurts.
Now it would be up to a jury to decide what really happened the night Michael Hunter died. In 1993, Joe Menino was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his former partner, Michael Hunter.
Joe Menino had everything to live for, had a bright future in front of him. He was a couple of weeks away from graduating from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a medical degree. He was on his way to a residency and just had a very bright future ahead of him.
Prosecutors believed that Menino was a spurned lover in a love triangle and killed Michael Hunter with a lethal injection of lidocaine, so he alone could be with Gary Walston. Menino claimed Hunter asked him for an injection to help him with his migraine headache, and that he accidentally gave him too much lidocaine. Gary Walston, the former partner of both the victim and the accused, didn't believe it.
Mike had a history of migraines, and they were pretty bad at times, and Joe would occasionally offer to give him something that would help him, and Mike always refused.
There were medical cases where lidocaine had been used in small amounts to treat migraines. Menino claimed he only meant to administer enough of the drug to ease his friend's pain. But prosecutors said Menino killed Michael Hunter and then concocted the suicide note to make it look like Hunter killed himself. When that didn't work, Menino had no choice but to say it was an accident.
He might have been smart as far as his learning was, but the people who commit crimes, especially like this, normally don't think ahead.
Prosecutors said Hunter's death was premeditated murder. They argued that Joe Menino had planned the killing for weeks. They said he waited until the third roommate, Gary Walston, was out of town on business. Then, after Michael Hunter was asleep, snuck into his room and injected him with a lethal concoction of cold medicine and lidocaine.
Joe went in there, filled up a syringe with lidocaine, and very slowly and carefully inserted it into Mike's arm, and he pushed the syringe. And then he removed the syringe, and before he walked out of the room, Mike was dead.
Investigators naturally asked if Michael would have felt the injection if he was asleep.
It is certainly conceivable that a well-trained hand could place that needle and not awaken you from sleep, and then slowly administer the drug, and you may never wake up from that.
But was Joe Menino capable of murder?
It was hard for me to believe that he would have done something like that, but there were undeniable facts involved. I mean, Mike was dead. He was there with him. He was the only person there with him. He was the only person with the means. So there were undeniable facts that pointed to him that I couldn't ignore.
After a 3-week trial, Joseph Menino was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison and will never be able to practice medicine. Some of the jurors believed it was possible that Michael Hunter agreed to the lidocaine injection.
The issue the jury struggled with was, did Mike consent or not? Joe said he consented. All of Mike's friends said he didn't. He would never have. And of course, Mike couldn't tell us.
Was involved in Mike's death and was covering it up.
The linguistics in this case was the first time I know it's ever been used in any kind of a police investigation to assist in making an arrest. I think it was a great tool. It should be used on a daily basis.
The murder of a beautiful young woman went unsolved for years. A murder with forensic evidence and plenty of suspects. But sometimes that's not enough. It took the victim's 9-year-old child, notations in a diary, and forensic psychology to determine which forensic evidence was important and which to ignore. 30-year-old Kathleen Lipscomb was trying to find her way, raising 2 young children while at the same time working as a nurse in San Antonio, Texas.
She was a very caring person. She loved her family.
Kathleen had been married for 8 years to Bill Lipscomb, a sergeant in the United States Air Force. Was for Bill to take care of their children on weekends. But one Sunday night, Kathleen didn't arrive to pick them up as planned. Bill drove the children to Kathleen's apartment, but she wasn't there, and her car was missing, so they left notes on her door. The next morning, there was still no sign of her.
One of her co-workers called me and told me that they were worried that she hadn't showed up for work.
My stomach kind of knotted up for a minute, and then I thought, no, Bill had the kids. Kathleen probably went out with some girlfriends or something, and she'll be in. She's just late today.
Later that same day, a man spotted a nude body along a deserted road outside of town. It was Kathleen Lipscomb. It was clear she had been murdered elsewhere.
Without a doubt, she had been transported from point A to this point B, being where she was left.
The fact that Kathleen's clothing had been rolled, not folded, told investigators something important.
That's definitely military. Just without a doubt, that's the only people that I have ever seen roll their clothes in that fashion is a military-type person.
Unfortunately, there were no discernible tire or footwear impressions near the body. Kathleen's estranged husband, Bill, was immediately called in for questioning.
I did check him to see if there were any wounds on his body, possibly any defensive wounds, to see if there was any kind of scrapes, bruisings, anything under his fingernails that would indicate where he had scratched anybody and could find none.
The children told police that their father was with them the entire weekend, confirming his alibi. At the autopsy, the medical examiner determined the cause of death was strangulation. It appeared Kathleen had sexual relations 24 hours before her death. Friends told police that Kathleen had been dating a married doctor in town, David Pearl.
Kathleen and Dr. Pearl worked together. Through their close association, Kathleen fell in love with him. And she was thoroughly confident that he loved her too. He promised to get a divorce and marry her.
We found out that Dr. Pearl had had many relationships and told his girlfriends that he was in fact separated from his wife when he wasn't. And, just the jealous ex-wife kind of thing, that was one concern of mine.
Dr. Pearl admitted he was with Kathleen during the weekend, but insisted he had nothing to do with her murder. And investigators had another suspect. Vincent Robideau, a nurse, worked with Kathleen at the hospital and lived in the same apartment complex. He hadn't shown up for work either.
He had left town. He didn't even go back to pick up his paycheck, nor did he even request it be sent to him.
With so many suspects, investigators hardly knew where to start. 1 week after Kathleen Lipscomb's murder, her car was found in a restaurant parking lot not far from her apartment. Investigators found no foreign fingerprints on or in the car. To determine the time of Kathleen's death, medical examiner Dr. Robert Bucks had two ways to tell.
She had eaten Chinese food. It was basically undigested, which indicates that she had eaten in a short period of time prior to her death.
And the marks on Kathleen's legs were identified as ant bites and helped establish a time frame.
Most of the ant activity occurs during daylight hours, so that probably occurred beginning around dawn on that morning.
These two indicators meant Kathleen had probably been killed around dinner time on Sunday night and dumped in the field before dawn. Forensic investigators found 4 strands of red human hair on Kathleen's clothing. Under a stereo microscope, scientists noticed the hairs had no root.
At the root end, you should see the root, which is a bulb-shaped structure.
In the late 80s, the forensic technology was not as advanced as it is today in 2003. So beyond that point, this is as far as we could go.
About the only bright spot in the investigation was when investigators located Vincent Robideau, Kathleen's co-worker and neighbor who disappeared the same weekend she was murdered.
He had gone back to Galveston, where he was from, and got a job there as a nurse with the local hospital because he had a fight with his boyfriend. And therefore, he just didn't want anything to do with San Antonio again.
Robideau was no longer a suspect.
We had hit a point to where we didn't feel like we were going to be able to solve it without some big break, and we just did not feel that that break would ever come.
Then investigators got another tip. Kathleen's neighbor said she saw a suspicious person leaving Kathleen's apartment on the same day her body had been found.
The neighbor actually just saw this red-headed lady walk up to the door and then a few minutes later walk away from the door.
Was this mysterious woman Kathleen's killer? For 2 long years, investigators searched for Kathleen Lipscomb's killer. Kathleen's family always suspected that her estranged husband, Bill, was somehow involved. Just 7 months before the murder, Bill had increased Kathleen's life insurance to $315,000. The family turned to a private investigator, Tom Bevins, for help. Bevins examined all of the personal items from Kathleen's apartment. In her diary, Bevins found 2 items of interest. The first was an unusual reference. It said, "Baseball tournament. Shannon Gilbert there."
When I first came across the name Shannon Gilbert, I didn't know what to make of it. It was obviously a name I had never seen or never heard of. And so my question was, why did Kathleen write it down? Obviously it meant something to her.
A background check revealed that Gilbert was in the Air Force with Kathleen's husband, Bill, and there were rumors the two were having a sexual affair. Bevins went to visit Shannon Gilbert.
She said, "Is this about Bill Lipscomb?" We said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." And she says, "I will need an attorney." And at that point, I knew I had something.
Bevins found another interesting entry in Kathleen's diary. It said, "Numerous calls and nights out, passing information about WAPS testing. Bill has all questions for the test." WAPS stands for Weighted Airman Promotion Test, which all military personnel must pass in order to gain promotion. Kathleen's entries suggested that her estranged husband, Bill, had cheated. Bill Lipscomb had been promoted faster than any other master sergeant in Air Force history. This entry possibly explained why. Since these cheating allegations involved the Air Force, Dr. Charles McDowell joined the investigation as part of the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
If you have a related peripheral crime, which in its own respect, I guess, was serious enough, but certainly doesn't compare to a murder case, that gives you a venue of access that makes it easier to get closer to your subject.
While reviewing the crime scene photos, Dr. McDowell made an important discovery.
The positioning of the body and the context of how it was found suggested to me that the scene had been staged in order to convey an impression that this was a rape murder. And this is where the victim wound up. And it didn't have a ring of authenticity to it.
Within 30, 45 minutes of reviewing the evidence, he told us that Bill did it. Bill was actually the murderer, where we had all at that point thought he just paid someone to do it.
Furthermore, McDowell believed Kathleen's crossed legs revealed the body had been another piece of new information.
She said to me, "Grandma, who do you think killed my mother or my mama?" And I said, "I don't know. Who do you think killed your mama?" And she told me, "My daddy did, because he wasn't where he said he was that night."
Hey, Tony, what's up, buddy? The children now revealed they were with their father's best friend, Tony Borello, who had taken them out for dinner on the night their mother was killed. And later that same night, the children said they woke up and discovered their father was not home and his car was gone.
I remember asking Tom Evans one day, what do they want? A picture with his hands around her neck? To me, we had so much evidence that was pointing to him, and we kept getting told, no, it's not enough, it's not enough. It's like, there wasn't anybody there to take a picture for you.
Bevins then requested forensic testing of the biological evidence collected during Kathleen's autopsy to determine the identity of the person Kathleen had been with before her death. Inexplicably, in the 2 years since the murder, the sample had been mislabeled, then mishandled. Forensic testing was no longer possible. Prosecutors needed more than just circumstantial evidence to corroborate the children's story. Kathleen Lipscomb's family hired a private investigator to help solve her murder. An entry in Kathleen's diary suggested that her estranged husband Bill had cheated on his military promotion tests and that Kathleen knew it. In addition, the divorce proceedings between Bill and Kathleen had been bitter. Bill wanted custody of the children, and Kathleen wasn't about to let that happen. Was it possible that Kathleen had been using that information as blackmail in her custody battle?
She knew it, and he knew that it would bust him, so that's the button she used. I mean, she pushed it, and he told her, you can't do this, because if you do, you're going to end up on a cold slab.
At the crime scene, Kathleen's clothing was neatly rolled, suggesting someone with military training dumped the body. The only other military person around Bill Lipscomb's home that weekend was Tony Borello. Months after the crime, Borello had been dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. When questioned, he was eager to talk.
He said he would go to church, he could hear God telling him, confess, confess your sins. And that's what changed Tony.
Tony Borello immediately acknowledged that he had dumped Kathleen's body in the field, just as Dr. McDowell suspected. And Borello said that Bill Lipscomb was the killer. He also confirmed something else, that Kathleen's body was stored in a cedar chest, which explained why her legs were folded when rigor mortis set in. Surprisingly, Tony Borello still had the chest. He said Bill Lipscomb asked him to dispose of it after the murder, but for some reason, Tony kept it. Forensic scientists found a tiny stain on the bottom of the chest. Testing confirmed that it was Kathleen's blood. Tony Borello met with Bill Lipscomb while wearing a hidden microphone, but he didn't say anything incriminating. So investigators devised another strategy.
This was an event that was a consequence of a marriage that went bad. There was a tremendous amount of anger. There was a tremendous amount of hostility. I wanted to see if I could feel that hostility so I could understand it and understand his reaction to it, and then develop an investigative methodology that would counter that and deal with his own psychology.
The OSI made sure that Bill Lipscomb knew he was being investigated.
I wanted him to hear footsteps that weren't there. I wanted him to have that feeling in the pit of his stomach every time the phone rang. I wanted him to worry about whether today was going to be the day that he heard the knock on the door. I wanted to raise his level of anxiety.
Eventually, Bill's former girlfriend, Shannon Gilbert, admitted that Bill once confided to her that he planned to kill Kathleen. And investigators let Lipscomb know that both Gilbert and Borello were cooperating.
Bill Lipscomb was playing mind games with us, and we were playing mind games with him.
After weeks of these psychological tactics, Dr. McDowell brought Bill Lipscomb in for questioning. Dr. McDowell vividly remembers the exchange.
Of all the ways this had to end, I don't understand why it had to end the way it did. Why did you kill her? And he said, I don't know why I killed her. But then he immediately caught himself and leaned forward and crossed his arms and said, I did not kill my wife. But we had him.
3 of us within the sheriff's office tried to get in on the same level as Bill and get him to break, and we couldn't do it. We could not do it.
Prosecutors believe Kathleen threatened to expose Bill's cheating on the military exams if he tried to get custody of the children. And with that, Bill sought revenge. On the day of the murder, Bill asked Tony Borello to take the children to dinner. Then he called Kathleen, asking her to pick up the children earlier than planned. When Kathleen arrived and noticed the children missing, the two argued.
Where are the kids? They wanted to go to McDonald's, so we went to go to McDonald's.
And at some point, Bill strangled her to death. Bill stored the body in a chest until nightfall. Kathleen's blood was found in the chest. Once the children were asleep, Tony Borello dumped Kathleen's body in the field, trying to make it appear to be a sex crime. But the positioning of the body and the fact the body was uncovered revealed the truth, that someone other than the killer was involved. But what about the red hairs on Kathleen's clothing?
I believe the hairs were planted by Bill Lipscomb or his partner, one of the two, to make it naturally throw us off to go looking for someone else.
Investigators later identified the woman who was seen leaving Kathleen's apartment after her murder. She was a co-worker who had gone to check on Kathleen when she didn't show up for work. Bill Lipscomb pled guilty to his wife's murder to avoid against Shannon Gilbert, who changed her name and is now in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Prosecutors do not believe Kathleen's boyfriend, Dr. David Pearl, had anything to do with the crime. Forensic pathology, forensic psychology, and crime scene reconstruction help solve a very complicated case.
There's one thing that you really do need to include is that this was a very complex investigation. It involved a very large number of people and a tremendous amount of careful coordination and orchestration. I feel kind of guilty because you're interviewing me.
People who commit crime think that they're very, very bright, and that the rest of us out here that try to solve crimes or work on crimes or are involved with law enforcement are not very bright. Most often it's the other way around.
The evidence had been sitting in a police evidence room for almost 40 years. Nobody knew it would become the piece that finally changed everything. In 1984, Salem was quieter than it is today. The streets were darker at night. Fewer cameras watched the roads. There were no cell phones tracking movements, no digital records documenting every transaction, no databases capable of instantly connecting one forgotten name to another. If someone disappeared, investigators depended on people remembering what they had seen. If someone lied, detectives depended on finding the lie. And if evidence was overlooked, it could remain forgotten for decades. On a cold November evening in 1984, 27-year-old Laura Bennett left her apartment in southeast Salem. She told a neighbor she would be gone for less than an hour. She never came back. At first, nobody thought it was a murder. Laura was young. She was independent. She worked at a local medical office and had a small circle of friends. She had no known history of disappearing. No one expected danger. Her neighbor remembered seeing Laura walk toward her car shortly after 8 o'clock. The parking lot was nearly empty. A light rain had begun falling. Laura carried a small purse and a paper bag. She unlocked her car. She got inside. Then she drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The next morning, Laura's supervisor called her apartment. No answer. Another call followed. Still nothing. By noon, her absence had become impossible to explain. Laura had not arrived at work. She had not called. She had not contacted her family. Her car was missing. Police were notified. At first, officers treated it as a missing person investigation. They checked hospitals. They checked local roads. They contacted friends. They searched places Laura was known to visit. Nothing. Then, shortly after midnight, a patrol officer noticed something unusual on a quiet road outside Salem. A vehicle was parked on the shoulder. The headlights were off. The driver's door was closed. The car appeared abandoned. The license plate belonged to Laura Bennett. Inside, officers found her purse. Her identification was still there. So were her keys. But Laura was gone. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. No broken window. No overturned seats. No blood visible inside the vehicle. That detail immediately complicated the investigation. If Laura had been abducted from the car, why was there no obvious evidence? If she had left voluntarily, where had she gone? And why would she leave her purse behind? The questions began multiplying. Investigators searched the area around the vehicle. They found footprints in wet soil. Most were too damaged by rain to identify. A second set appeared farther from the road. That discovery changed the tone of the search. Detectives began treating the vehicle not simply as an abandoned car, but as a possible crime scene. Officers photographed everything. They collected fibers. They collected fragments. They searched beneath the seats. They examined the trunk. They checked the doors. They looked for fingerprints. At the time, forensic technology was nothing like what investigators have today. A tiny trace of biological material might be collected without anyone knowing whether it would ever become useful. A fingerprint might be too incomplete to identify. A fiber might simply be labeled and placed into an evidence envelope. Investigators could not predict which piece would matter. They had to collect what they could. And they did. By sunrise, Laura's disappearance had become a major investigation. Search teams moved through the surrounding area. Officers checked drainage ditches. Volunteers walked through wooded sections. Dogs were brought in. The weather made everything harder. Rain softened the ground. Wind scattered leaves. Footprints disappeared. Small pieces of evidence became almost impossible to distinguish from debris. But the search continued. For 2 days. Then 3. Then 4. On the 5th morning, a hunter discovered something along an isolated stretch of land outside the city. At first, he thought it was clothing. Then he saw the body. Police arrived within minutes. The scene was secured. The victim was eventually identified as Laura Bennett. She had been dead for several days. The missing person investigation became a homicide investigation, and Salem suddenly had a murder. The medical examiner determined that Laura had suffered fatal injuries consistent with homicide. Investigators began reconstructing her final hour. She had left her apartment. She had driven away. At some point, she had encountered someone. Her car had been abandoned. And somehow, Laura had ended up miles away. The killer had vanished. There was no obvious eyewitness. No confession. No weapon. No clear motive. Only fragments. A vehicle. A purse. A few damaged footprints. A handful of fibers. And a woman who would never return home. Detectives started with Laura's personal life. They interviewed coworkers, friends, neighbors, former acquaintances, anyone who had spoken to her during the days before her death. They wanted to know whether Laura had been frightened, whether she had received threats, whether someone had been following her, whether she had mentioned a stranger. One coworker remembered Laura saying that someone had called her apartment several times, but Laura had not seemed particularly worried. Another friend said Laura had recently argued with someone. The identity of that person became an early lead. Detectives questioned him. He denied threatening Laura. He denied seeing her that night. He provided an explanation for his whereabouts. At the time, investigators could not disprove it. The lead weakened. Then another name appeared. A man who had occasionally done repair work near Laura's apartment building. He knew the residence. He knew the parking lot. He knew when people came and went. That alone meant nothing. But investigators discovered that he had spoken with Laura shortly before her disappearance. He admitted the conversation. He said it was brief. He said he had not seen her afterward. Again, there was no evidence strong enough to hold him. The investigation widened. Detectives followed dozens of leads. Some ended immediately. Others lasted weeks. Every possible suspect had to be considered. But without a witness, the case remained difficult. The investigators needed something physical, something that could survive questioning, something that could connect a person to Laura. They returned to the car. The vehicle was processed again. Every item was cataloged. The steering wheel, the door handles, the seats, the floor, the trunk, the paper bag, the fibers. The officers noticed something near the passenger side floor, a small dark fiber. It did not match Laura's clothing. It was collected, placed into an evidence envelope, cataloged, then stored. At the time, nobody knew what it was. It could have come from a coat, a blanket, a car seat, a carpet, almost anything. The detective wrote the item into the report, then moved on. There were hundreds of other pieces of information competing for attention. The case continued. Weeks passed, then months. The suspect interviews produced nothing. The laboratory reports produced no decisive identification. The footprints were inconclusive. The fiber could not be linked to a specific person. The weapon was never recovered. And the investigation began losing momentum. That is how a murder becomes a cold case. Not with one dramatic moment. There is no bell, no announcement. One day, detectives simply have fewer places to look. The active leads disappear. The phone stops ringing. The newspapers move on. The family continues waiting. The case remains open. But the investigation becomes quiet. For Laura's family, there was nothing quiet about it. Her mother kept her bedroom almost unchanged. Her younger brother refused to believe that the investigation was finished. He called detectives periodically. He asked whether anything had happened. Most of the time, the answer was the same. Nothing new. Years passed. The file remained. The evidence remained. The names remained. But the people changed. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved. Buildings were demolished. Roads were reconstructed. The city expanded. And the murder slowly became a story that fewer people remembered. Then came the first major break. It happened almost 40 years after Laura disappeared. A detective assigned to review old homicide files opened Laura's case. There was no expectation of a miracle. The detective simply wanted to determine whether any evidence had never been fully tested. The original reports were scanned. The evidence inventory was reviewed. The old photographs were examined. And then the detective found the reference. Item 84. 117. A small fiber recovered from Laura's vehicle. The description was only a few lines. Dark synthetic material. Recovered from passenger side floor. Preserved. Untested beyond original microscopic comparison. The detective stopped. Untested. After all those years, the evidence had never produced an identification. That did not mean it contained the answer, but it meant nobody could say for certain that it did not. The item was retrieved from storage. The envelope was old. The label was faded. But the chain of custody was intact. Inside was the same tiny fragment investigators had collected in 1984. A piece of evidence so small that it could fit beneath a fingernail. For decades, it had meant nothing. Now modern forensic technology had changed the possibilities. Investigators submitted the material for advanced examination. The laboratory began testing. And for the first time since Laura Bennett disappeared, a piece of evidence from the original crime scene was about to speak. The question was whether it would say anything at all, because after nearly 40 years, investigators had learned one painful truth. The past does not always leave answers behind. Sometimes it leaves only fragments. A photograph, a statement, a footprint washed away by rain, a vehicle abandoned in darkness, a fiber trapped beneath a seat. And sometimes, if that fragment survives long enough, science can finally reveal what investigators could not see the first time. The laboratory report was still pending. The detectives waited. The family waited. And somewhere inside that old evidence envelope was a clue that had been silent since 1984. Nobody yet knew whether it would identify a killer. Nobody knew whether it would eliminate a suspect. Nobody knew whether the case was about to change forever. But after 38 years, the forgotten evidence was finally being examined again. And this time, the investigators were ready to listen. The laboratory report did not arrive with sirens. There was no dramatic phone call in the middle of the night. No detective running through a hallway. No television camera waiting outside the station. The breakthrough began quietly inside a laboratory where a technician examined a piece of evidence that had been collected in 1984. A small dark fiber. Item 84. 117. For decades, it had been almost meaningless. A fragment. A question mark. Something investigators had preserved because they knew better than to throw evidence away, even when they had no way to explain it. Now the technology was different. The laboratory could examine characteristics that investigators in 1984 could never have analyzed with the same precision. The fiber itself could not tell a story. It could not say who touched it. It could not explain why it was inside Laura Bennett's car, but it could provide a comparison. That was enough. The detectives waited for the first result. And while they waited, they returned to the old file. They read everything. Again, the original missing person report, the first search, the discovery of Laura's vehicle, the discovery of her body, the autopsy, the witness interviews, the suspect interviews, the evidence inventory, the photographs, the handwritten notes. Everything. One detail kept appearing. Laura had not appeared frightened when she left her apartment. That suggested she had not expected danger. She knew where she was going. She may have known the person she was meeting. That possibility became important. If the killer had been a complete stranger, why would Laura have entered the situation willingly? If she trusted the person, how had that trust been used against her? Investigators began rebuilding the final evening. It was not easy. The original reports did not provide a perfect timeline. Sometimes were approximate. Some witnesses remembered only portions of the evening. Some accounts had been recorded days after the event. But a pattern emerged. Laura left her apartment shortly after 8. She was seen near her vehicle. She drove away. Later that night, her car was found abandoned. The body was discovered days afterward. The gap between those points was where the murder had occurred. The detectives wanted to fill it. They began checking old telephone records where available. They examined employment records. They reviewed addresses. They looked at people who had interacted with Laura during the final week of her life. One name appeared repeatedly: Daniel Mercer. He was not Laura's boyfriend. He was not a family member. He was not a close friend. He had worked as a contractor in the area and had occasionally performed maintenance work near Laura's apartment complex. In 1984, investigators had interviewed him. He had admitted knowing Laura. He said they had spoken several times, but he denied having any romantic relationship with her. He denied meeting her the night she disappeared. His statement had been considered. Then the case moved on. Now detectives looked at Mercer differently. The original report contained something they had not noticed before. Mercer had told investigators he had been working late that evening. He had given the name of a coworker who supposedly saw him. But when detectives checked the old statement, the coworker had never been formally interviewed. That was strange. If the coworker could confirm Mercer's alibi, why had nobody followed up? The new detective searched for the man. The original name was incomplete. There was no current address, no recent phone number. The investigator searched employment record. Nothing. Then an old newspaper archive produced a possible lead. The co-worker had moved out of Oregon years earlier, but he was alive. Investigators located him, and when they asked about November 1984, the man's reaction surprised them. He remembered Daniel Mercer, but he did not remember working with him that night. That single statement did not prove anything. Memory after 38 years was unreliable, but it created a problem. Mercer's original alibi could no longer be treated as solid. The detective went back to the file. The old statement was read again. Mercer had been confident. He had given specific details. He claimed he worked until nearly midnight. He claimed he went home directly afterward, but there was no independent documentation proving it. The investigator checked other records. A local business had closed decades earlier. Its employment files were gone. The building itself had been demolished. The past had erased the paper trail, but not everything had disappeared. A former supervisor was still alive. He remembered Mercer. He remembered the job. And he remembered something else. Mercer had left early that night. The supervisor could not remember exactly when, but he believed it was before 9. That was a problem. Laura had left her apartment shortly after 8. Mercer had claimed he was working elsewhere. Now a former supervisor remembered him leaving. The timeline tightened. Investigators needed to know where Mercer went. They searched for additional witnesses. One former employee remembered seeing Mercer near his vehicle. Another remembered that Mercer had been unusually quiet the next day. Neither observation was enough. But the detective now had a reason to look closer. The fiber evidence was still being tested. The witnesses were being re-examined. The old alibi was weakening. And another discovery emerged. In the original case, file was a photograph of Laura's vehicle. The photograph showed the passenger side floor. Near the edge of the carpet was a small dark mark. The image was grainy. The original investigator had circled the area. Item 84, 117, the fiber. The detective compared the photograph with old records concerning Mercer's work. He had performed upholstery and flooring repair. His work involved synthetic material. That did not prove anything. Thousands of people worked with similar material. The detective knew that. But now the fiber had context. It was not simply a mysterious fragment. It could potentially tell investigators whether it came from a material associated with someone connected to Laura. The laboratory completed its first examination. The result was not an identification, but it was useful. The fiber contained characteristics consistent with a specific type of industrial synthetic material. The material was unusual enough to narrow the possibility. Investigators searched old business records. They found a company that had supplied that material in Salem during the 1980s. Mercer had worked for a contractor that used it. Again, coincidence was possible. But the case was accumulating coincidences. The detectives were careful. They did not want to build a theory around circumstantial connection. They needed independent evidence. So they looked at the physical evidence again. The vehicle, the fiber, the fingerprints, the photographs, the original search. They asked whether anything else had been missed. Then they found another item, a small fragment recovered from Laura's clothing. It had been classified in 1984 as an unidentified synthetic material. It had never been compared with the fiber from the vehicle. Now investigators sent both items to the laboratory. The laboratory compared their chemical and physical characteristics. The results showed similarities. The two fragments were consistent with the same material type. That did not establish who had left the material, but it suggested that the evidence from the vehicle and the victim might have a common source. Investigators now had two related fragments, one from the car, one from Laura's clothing, the same type of material, and Mercer had a professional connection to that material. The case was becoming more complicated, but it was also becoming more focused. Then investigators found something unexpected in the original autopsy record. There had been microscopic debris collected from Laura's clothing. The material had been preserved. At the time, investigators had not been able to identify it. The evidence had been stored for decades. Now it was tested. The laboratory found a mixture of fiber. Some were consistent with Laura's own clothing. Others were not. One fragment was unusual. It was consistent with the same synthetic material found in the vehicle. The detectives stared at the report. The same unusual material appeared in two separate locations. Laura's clothing, Laura's car. That meant the material could have been transferred. Someone or something had moved between those locations. The question became whether Mercer had access to it. Investigators searched his employment history. He had worked with the material. They located former coworkers. One remembered Mercer frequently carrying rolls of the material in his vehicle. Another remembered that he had complained about the material sticking to clothing. That sounded insignificant. But in a homicide investigation, insignificance can change quickly. Investigators searched for records of Mercer's vehicles. The vehicle he owned in 1984 was gone, but photographs existed. An old insurance record showed the model. A former mechanic remembered working on it. The detective wanted to know whether that vehicle could have transported Laura. The answer was uncertain. The original vehicle had been sold. No forensic examination was possible. Again, the case encountered a wall. The detective could not prove that Laura had ever been inside Mercer's vehicle, but they could establish that Mercer had access to the same type of material found on Laura. The next question was more important. Did Mercer know Laura well enough to persuade her to leave with him? A former neighbor provided an answer. She remembered seeing Mercer speaking with Laura several times. She said Laura appeared comfortable around him. There had been no obvious conflict. That meant Laura could have willingly approached him. The investigators now had a possible scenario. Laura leaves home. She meets someone she knows. She enters a vehicle or travels with that person. Something happens. Her own vehicle is later abandoned. The killer leaves the area, but investigators still needed proof. The scenario was not enough. The laboratory result was still incomplete. The detectives were waiting for the most important question. Could the old evidence contain biological material? The fiber itself might not, but other evidence could. The original investigators had collected material from Laura's clothing. Some samples had been preserved. At the time, they had been examined only under the technology available in 1984. Modern testing offered another possibility. The detectives requested advanced DNA analysis. The laboratory accepted the evidence. The chain of custody was checked. The samples were transferred under controlled conditions. Then the waiting began again. Meanwhile, investigators revisited another part of the case. The phone calls. Laura had reportedly received repeated calls before her disappearance. The original reports described them as unwanted, but not threatening. The caller had never been identified. In 1984, tracing a call could be difficult. There were no smartphones, no digital caller identification, no instant location history. Some telephone records had been lost. Others were incomplete. But investigators found a handwritten note in the original file. Laura had written down a number that had never been fully investigated. The detective checked it. The number had been disconnected decades earlier, but an old directory linked it to a business. The business had been associated with one of Mercer's former employers. That was the first connection between Mercer and the unexplained call. It was not proof. It was another lead. The detective followed it. A former employee remembered Mercer using the business phone. He said Mercer sometimes called people from there, but he could not remember whom. Again, memory. Again, uncertainty. Yet the pattern continued. Laura had received unexplained calls. Mercer had access to a phone associated with the number. Mercer knew Laura. Mercer had been interviewed in 1984. His alibi was now questionable. Material associated with his work had appeared in evidence connected to Laura, and the laboratory was testing preserved biological material. The detectives were no longer asking whether Mercer should be considered. They were asking what else could be proven. Then the laboratory called. The DNA testing had produced a partial profile. The result was not complete, but it was enough to indicate that biological material from an unknown male was present. That changed the case. The detectives now had a biological clue. The profile was compared against available databases. Nothing immediately matched. The search returned no known suspect, no name, no arrest, no answer. But the profile could be preserved, and that mattered, because investigators could now compare it against specific individuals. Mercer became the obvious candidate. But obtaining a reference sample had to be done lawfully. The detectives watched him. They documented his movements. They did not confront him. They waited. They knew that a careless mistake could damage the case. Then, unexpectedly, the opportunity came. Mercer discarded an item containing biological material. Investigators lawfully recovered it. The sample was sent to the laboratory. A comparison was performed. The result arrived several days later. The partial profile from Laura's evidence was consistent with Mercer's DNA. The probability was extraordinarily strong. For the first time, the investigators had something that did not depend on a witness remembering 38 years earlier. They had science. The detective read the report twice. Then a third time. The old case had changed in a single document. The man who had once been only a name in a 1984 report was now connected to biological evidence recovered from the original investigation. But investigators still had to prove when and how that material got there. That question would become central, because DNA could place Mercer in contact with Laura. It could not automatically prove murder. The prosecution would need the rest. The timeline, the abandoned vehicle, the fibers, the witness statements, the false or questionable alibi, the phone calls, the location, the forensic evidence. Every piece had to fit. And as detectives began putting everything together, they realized something that made the case even more disturbing. The evidence had never been completely absent. It had been there from the beginning. The fiber, the unidentified material, the old telephone number, the incomplete alibi, the forgotten witness, the biological sample. The clues were scattered across decades. No single detective had seen all of them at once. The original investigators had not been careless. They had been working with limited technology and incomplete information. The new detectives had something the original team could never have possessed: hindsight, modern science, digital records, and the ability to search decades of information in ways that had been impossible in 1984. The murder had not changed. The evidence had not changed. The interpretation had. Now investigators had to decide what to do next. They could not simply announce that the case was solved. They had to build it, piece by piece, fact by fact, evidence by evidence. Because after 38 years, the difference between a breakthrough and a conviction would depend on one thing: whether the evidence could tell a complete story. And the story was beginning to take shape. Laura had trusted someone. That person had become the last link between her life and her death. And for almost 4 decades, that link had remained hidden inside evidence nobody knew how to read. Now the detectives knew the name: Daniel Mercer. They had the DNA. They had the timeline. They had the old statements. And they had one final problem. They still had to prove what happened after Laura got into that car, because somewhere in those missing hours was the moment when a disappearance became a murder. And that moment was still waiting to be reconstructed. The name was Daniel Mercer. For 38 years, that name had existed inside the investigation without becoming the answer. Now it was different. Now the name was connected to a DNA profile, a profile recovered from evidence collected in 1984, evidence that had survived in storage, evidence that had been almost forgotten, evidence that modern science had finally been able to interpret. But the detectives knew better than to celebrate. A DNA match could change an investigation. It could not, by itself, reconstruct a murder. It could not explain the missing hour. It could not tell a jury what happened between the moment Laura Bennett left her apartment and the moment her body was discovered. The detectives needed the story, not a theory, not a guess, a sequence of events supported by evidence. And that meant going back to the night Laura disappeared. They started with the last confirmed sighting. 8 o'clock. Laura leaving her apartment. The rain had already begun. The parking lot was dark. Her neighbor saw her unlock the driver's door. Laura placed a paper bag inside the car. She entered. The engine started. Then she drove away. The neighbor remembered nothing unusual. No argument. No shouting. No struggle. No second person. At the time, that seemed ordinary. Now it was one of the most important observations in the entire file. Laura had not been forced into her car. She had not appeared frightened. She had left voluntarily. That suggested one possibility. She knew where she was going. And perhaps she knew the person she intended to meet. Investigators returned to Laura's phone record. The records were incomplete, but the old notes contained references to several calls received during the previous week. The number that appeared most often was associated with a business where Mercer had worked. That connection had been overlooked in 1984. Now it seemed significant. The detectives searched the old business address. The building was gone. A modern structure stood in its place, but the city's archived records still contained information about the company. Mercer had worked there. He had access to the telephone. He had access to the vehicles. And he had known Laura. The connection was becoming difficult to dismiss. But detectives still needed to understand why Laura would agree to meet him. They found the answer in an old statement from one of Laura's friends. The friend remembered Laura mentioning Mercer, not romantically, not fearfully, just casually. Laura had apparently asked Mercer for help with a problem involving her car. That detail had been buried in the original interview. The detective circled it. If Laura expected Mercer to help with her car, then meeting him would have seemed completely normal. She had no reason to believe she was walking toward danger. That possibility fit the evidence. It also explained why there had been no struggle at her apartment. Laura left willingly. She drove to meet someone. Then something happened. The next confirmed location was her abandoned vehicle. Investigators examined the distance between the two locations. The drive could have been made in less than 20 minutes. That left a narrow window. The detectives reconstructed it again. 8 o'clock. Laura leaves. 8:10. Possible travel. 8:20. Potential meeting. After that, the timeline becomes uncertain. Then the abandoned vehicle. The detectives looked at Mercer's own movement. His original statement claimed he had been working late, but the former supervisor had remembered him leaving early. The co-worker he had named as an alibi witness had denied remembering him working that night. The old alibi was collapsing. But prosecutors would need more than a weak alibi. They needed evidence connecting Mercer to the crime itself. That was where the DNA became critical. The biological material recovered from Laura's clothing was consistent with Mercer. The laboratory could not determine the exact moment of transfer, but it established a connection. Investigators asked whether Mercer could have had innocent contact with Laura. The answer was yes. He had known her. He had spoken with her. He had worked around her apartment. There were innocent explanations. That meant the DNA alone could not solve the case. The detectives needed the surrounding evidence. They examined the fiber evidence. The unusual synthetic material found inside Laura's vehicle matched material associated with Mercer's work. A similar material had also been recovered from Laura's clothing. Again, there was an innocent possibility. Mercer worked with the material. He could have encountered Laura during ordinary circumstances, but investigators noticed something else. The material was not common household fabric. It was a specialized industrial product. Mercer had regularly handled it. Laura had no known reason to possess it. The detectives sent the material for additional comparison. The laboratory confirmed the fibers were highly consistent. That still was not enough for an arrest, but it strengthened the chain. Then investigators returned to the abandoned vehicle. The original photographs showed something that had not received much attention in 1984. The passenger seat was pushed farther back than Laura normally positioned it. That detail came from a friend who knew how Laura drove. She was short. She kept the seat close to the steering wheel. In the photographs, the passenger seat was positioned unusually far backward. That could mean nothing. Someone could have moved it. A mechanic could have adjusted it. Laura herself could have changed it. But investigators now asked a different question. Could someone else have been sitting there? The answer was possible. The detectives examined the passenger side door. The original evidence report mentioned a faint partial fingerprint. It had been too incomplete for identification in 1984. Modern technology allowed investigators to enhance the image. The print was still insufficient for a definitive identification, but its location was interesting. It was on the interior door handle. A person sitting in the passenger seat could have left it. The detectives compared the pattern with Mercer's known print. The result was inconclusive. The print was too degraded. That was frustrating. Another clue. Another partial answer. Another dead end. But the case was no longer dependent on one piece of evidence. The detectives were building a mosaic, and every piece mattered. They interviewed former neighbors again. One woman remembered seeing a dark pickup near Laura's apartment on the night she disappeared. She could not remember the license plate. She could not remember the exact model, but she remembered a distinctive feature, a damaged taillight. Investigators searched old photographs of Mercer's vehicles. One truck matched the description. The passenger side rear light had been damaged around the same period. Mercer had repaired it shortly afterward. That information came from an old repair invoice. The invoice was dated 3 days after Laura disappeared. The detectives stared at the date. 3 days. The truck had been damaged. The witness remembered a damaged taillight. Mercer had given no explanation for the damage. Again, none of it was proof. But the pattern was becoming stronger. The detective requested the old repair record. It contained one line of handwritten information. Customer reports damage occurred while parked. That was Mercer's explanation. But investigators now had another question. Where had the truck been parked? No location was recorded. The mechanic had not asked. Or if he had, the answer was not written down. Another missing detail. Another gap. The detectives began looking for someone who might remember. The repair shop had closed years earlier, but the mechanic was alive. He was contacted. He remembered Mercer. He remembered the truck. He remembered the damaged taillight. And he remembered something that was not in the invoice. Mercer had arrived late at night. He seemed nervous. He had asked whether the repair could be done quickly. The mechanic could not remember the exact date until investigators showed him the invoice. Then the memory returned. It had been shortly after the murder. That statement did not prove Mercer had killed Laura, but it gave investigators another piece. The truck, the damaged light, the witness, the repair, the timeline. Everything was beginning to point toward the same night. The detectives now examined whether the truck could have been involved in moving Laura. The original investigation had focused almost entirely on her own vehicle. They had never thoroughly examined Mercer's truck. There was nothing left to examine physically. It had been sold decades ago, but investigators could reconstruct its size and interior. They compared it with the known crime scene evidence. The theory was possible, but investigators needed more. They returned to the location where Laura's body had been found. The area had changed. The road was wider. Nearby properties had been developed, but old aerial photographs survived. Investigators compared the landscape from 1984 with the present. The location had been isolated. A vehicle could have entered without being noticed. A person could have approached the area without witnesses. That mattered. The killer had not needed a complicated plan. They had needed privacy. And in 1984, there had been plenty of it. The detectives walked the old route. They measured travel times. They checked whether Mercer could have reached the location within the relevant window. He could. The timeline allowed it. That was another piece. Still, one question remained. Why Laura? Investigators looked into her life during the weeks before the murder. They found a financial dispute. Not a large one, but significant enough to matter. Laura had discovered irregularities involving money connected to a contractor. The contractor was not Mercer, but Mercer had worked for the company. Laura had apparently asked questions. She had wanted documents. She had become uncomfortable. A coworker remembered Laura saying she did not trust someone connected to the business. She never gave a name. The detective wondered whether the statement had been recorded somewhere. It had, buried inside a personnel interview. The coworker had told police in 1984 that Laura had complained about someone at the contractor's office. The original detective had not followed the lead, perhaps because there were too many possibilities. Now investigators had a reason to revisit it. They interviewed the coworker again. The woman was older. Her memory was incomplete. But one thing remained. She remembered the name Mercer. She said Laura had mentioned him in connection with the dispute. That was significant. Mercer was not simply someone who happened to know Laura. He may have had a reason to fear what she knew. The detectives searched business records. The contractor had been involved in several questionable financial transactions during the period. Nothing had resulted in criminal charges, but investigators found that Laura had requested information. She had apparently been asking questions about payments. The motive began taking shape. It was not jealousy. It was not random violence. It may have been an attempt to silence someone. But detectives still needed to prove that theory. They examined Laura's personal papers. Some had been preserved by her family. Among them was a handwritten note. The note contained a name. The handwriting was Laura's. The name was Mercer. Under it were 2 words, "Ask why." That discovery stunned investigators. The note had never been included in the original police file. Laura's family had kept it among personal belongings. They had not understood its importance. The detective photographed it. The handwriting was examined. The note appeared authentic. But what did "ask why" mean? There was no date, no explanation, no additional sentence. It could have referred to something completely unrelated, but the timing was disturbing. The note had been found among papers Laura had used during the weeks before her death. The detectives now had a possible motive, a possible connection, a possible timeline, a DNA link, a fiber link, a questionable alibi, a damaged vehicle, and a witness who remembered Mercer near Laura's apartment. The case had transformed. For 38 years, the investigation had been a collection of unanswered questions. Now those questions were beginning to connect. But investigators knew the most dangerous stage was still ahead. They had to decide whether the evidence was strong enough to accuse a man of murder committed nearly 4 decades earlier. They could not afford to be wrong. A wrongful accusation would destroy the credibility of the entire investigation. So they tested everything: the DNA, the fiber, the timeline, the witness statements, the old records, the handwritten note, the vehicle evidence. Every fact was challenged. Every alternative explanation was considered. And then the detectives found the detail that finally changed their understanding of the case. The DNA was not simply on Laura's clothing. It was found in a location that investigators believed was directly connected to the fatal assault. That made an innocent explanation much harder. The laboratory performed additional testing. The result remained consistent. Mercer's DNA, Laura's evidence, the same case, the same night, the same 38-year-old mystery. Now the detectives had something they believed could withstand scrutiny. They prepared the investigative package. The prosecutor reviewed it. Questions were asked. More documents were requested. The detectives supplied them. The prosecutor asked about the old alibi. They supplied the new witness statement. Questions about the fibers. They supplied the laboratory comparison. Questions about the DNA. They supplied the complete forensic report. Questions about motive. They supplied the financial records. Piece by piece, the case became harder to dismiss. The warrant request was prepared. For the first time since 1984, the investigation had reached a moment nobody had expected to see again. An arrest was coming. But before the suspect could be taken into custody, investigators had one final task. They had to find him. Daniel Mercer had lived under the radar for decades. He had changed addresses. He had changed jobs. He had built a life that had nothing to do, publicly, with Laura Bennett. But the investigators found him. He was living outside Oregon. He had no idea that the evidence from 1984 had survived. He had no idea that modern testing had connected him to the case. And he had no idea that detectives had reconstructed the night. The warrant was approved. The arrest team began planning. There would be no warning, no press conference, no public announcement. The investigators wanted the operation quiet, because the man they believed had escaped justice for nearly 4 decades was about to hear the name he had not heard in an official accusation since 1984, Laura Bennett. The case was no longer cold. The evidence had finally spoken. And this time, investigators were listening. The arrest team arrived before sunrise. The sky was still dark. Daniel Mercer was inside the house. He had lived there for years. To his neighbors, he was simply an older man who kept to himself. There was nothing about the quiet house that suggested a homicide investigation. Nothing suggested that detectives had been rebuilding a murder case around him. Nothing suggested that a 38-year-old file had suddenly become active again. Then the knock came. Mercer opened the door. For a moment, nobody spoke. A lay detective showed his badge, then the warrant. Mercer's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The detective watched his eyes move across the document. Then he said the words Mercer had spent decades believing he would never hear. "You're under arrest for the murder of Laura Bennett." The house became silent. Mercer did not immediately respond. He looked at the detective, then at the warrant, then back at the detective. He asked one question. Why now? The answer was simple. DNA. The detective did not explain the entire case. He did not need to. Mercer was handcuffed. The door closed behind him. And 38 years after Laura Bennett disappeared, the man investigators believed was responsible was finally in custody. News spread through Salem within hours. The headline appeared everywhere. A forgotten murder. A decades-old disappearance. A DNA breakthrough. An arrest. For Laura's family, the news was almost impossible to absorb. They had heard versions of hope before. Every few years, another investigator would contact them. Another lead. Another possible suspect. Another review. Then nothing. This time was different. There was a name. There was an arrest. There was forensic evidence. There was a courtroom. But an arrest is not a conviction. The investigators knew that. The prosecutor knew it. And the defense would make sure everyone remembered it. Mercer's attorney immediately challenged the case. The defense argued that the DNA evidence could have an innocent explanation. Mercer had known Laura. He had worked near her apartment. He had interacted with her. Contact was possible. The defense questioned the age of the evidence. They questioned the preservation methods. They questioned the laboratory testing. They questioned witness memories. And they attacked the timeline. 38 years was a long time. People forget. Records disappear. Buildings are demolished. Vehicles are destroyed. Witnesses die. Memories change. The defense argued that investigators were trying to reconstruct a story from fragments. The prosecution responded with the evidence. Not emotion. Not headlines. Evidence. The biological material had been collected in 1984. It had remained sealed. The chain of custody was documented. The modern laboratory testing produced a profile consistent with Mercer. The evidence had not appeared yesterday. It had existed since the original investigation. That distinction mattered. The prosecution argued that modern science had not created evidence. It had revealed information already contained inside evidence collected decades earlier. The courtroom became the new crime scene. Every old document mattered. Every statement was examined. Every photograph was enlarged. Every timestamp was questioned. The prosecutor began with Laura. Not the suspect. Not the DNA. Laura. She was 27 years old. She had a job, friends, family, plans. She had walked out of her apartment expecting to return. She never did. The prosecution showed photographs from 1984. Laura smiling. Laura with friends. Laura at work. The photographs were old. The faces were young. The room became quiet. Then the prosecutor showed the photograph of Laura's abandoned car. The contrast was brutal. One image showed a woman alive. The next showed the vehicle from which she disappeared. The case was no longer an abstract collection of evidence. It had a victim. Then came the timeline. 8 o'clock. Laura leaves. The possible meeting. The abandoned vehicle. The later discovery of her body. The prosecution placed each event on a board. The defense immediately challenged the uncertainty. There were no cameras, no electronic location record, no GPS, no modern digital trail. But the prosecutor did not pretend there was certainty where there was none. Instead, the case was presented as a series of independently supported facts. That made the timeline more powerful. Laura left her apartment. Mercer had a connection to her. Mercer's original alibi was contradicted by a former coworker. A vehicle associated with Mercer had damage shortly after the murder. A witness remembered a similar vehicle near Laura's apartment. Specialized fibers associated with Mercer's work were recovered from evidence connected to Laura, and biological material recovered from the original investigation produced a DNA profile consistent with Mercer. The defense attacked each piece individually. But prosecutors kept bringing the pieces back together. One fiber could be coincidence. One witness could be mistaken. One damaged taillight could be unrelated. One questionable statement could be explained. One DNA result could theoretically have an innocent explanation. But the question was not whether each piece could be explained separately. The question was whether all of them could be explained together. That was harder. Much harder. The prosecution then introduced the old telephone evidence. Laura had received repeated calls before her death. The number had been connected to a business associated with Mercer. The defense argued that multiple employees had access to the phone. That was true. The prosecutor acknowledged it. But then another document appeared, a handwritten note from Laura. The name Mercer. 2 words. Ask why. The defense objected. The judge allowed the note to be considered only within its proper evidentiary context. The prosecutor did not claim the note was a confession or a direct accusation. It was simply evidence of Laura's concern, evidence that she had written Mercer's name before she died. The defense argued that the note could have referred to anything. That was also true. Nobody could prove what Laura meant, but the note added another layer to the investigation. Then came the witness from the repair shop. The mechanic took the stand. He was older now. His hair was white. His voice was slower. He remembered Mercer bringing in the truck. He remembered the damaged taillight. He remembered Mercer appearing nervous. The defense asked how he could remember something from 1984. The mechanic admitted he could not remember every detail, but he had the original repair invoice. The date was written on it. The vehicle description was recorded. His testimony was not based entirely on memory. It was anchored by a document created at the time. That distinction strengthened the prosecution's argument. The mechanic had not suddenly invented the memory after investigators contacted him. The paper had existed for decades. The repair had existed. The date had existed. Only the significance was new. Then came the DNA expert. The courtroom became silent. The expert explained the testing process, the original evidence, the preservation, the modern analysis, the profile, the comparison, the probability. The defense asked about contamination. The expert explained the safeguard. They asked about transfer. The expert acknowledged that transfer was scientifically possible. Then came the critical question. Could the DNA have reached the evidence through ordinary innocent contact? The expert could not completely exclude every theoretical possibility. Science rarely speaks in absolute terms, but the location and condition of the biological material made the prosecution's interpretation far more likely. The defense pushed harder. The expert remained calm. The DNA did not say, Daniel Mercer killed Laura Bennett. DNA does not speak that way. It says something narrower. A biological profile was present. That profile was consistent with Mercer. The rest of the case had to establish what that meant. That was exactly what the prosecution attempted to do. The next witness was one of the detectives who reopened the case. He described finding the old evidence inventory. He described the faded envelope. He described reading the phrase untested beyond original comparison. He described requesting the evidence. Then he described the moment the laboratory result arrived. The defense asked whether investigators had already suspected Mercer before the DNA test. The detective answered yes. That admission was important. The defense argued that investigators had become focused on Mercer and interpreted later evidence through that theory. Confirmation bias. The detective did not deny the possibility. Instead, he explained that the DNA evidence had been tested independently. The laboratory did not know the entire theory behind the case. The result existed before investigators knew what it would show. That made the forensic evidence harder to dismiss. Then prosecutors introduced the original 1984 detective's notes. The handwriting was unmistakably old. One page contained a sentence that had barely been noticed for decades. Mercer appears to know more than he is saying. The courtroom went silent again. The defense objected. The judge reviewed the document. The note was admitted only to establish the direction of the original investigation, not as proof of guilt. That distinction mattered. The original detective had suspected Mercer, but suspicion had not been enough. The prosecutor emphasized the point. In 1984, the evidence did not meet the threshold needed to make the case. There had been no DNA match, no confirmed connection, no reliable timeline. The investigation stalled. Mercer remained free. 38 years later, the evidence had changed, not because investigators wanted it to, because science had advanced. The defense then presented its own theory. They suggested Laura could have encountered Mercer innocently. They suggested the DNA may have come from an earlier interaction. They questioned whether the fibers were truly unique. They challenged the witness who remembered the truck. They argued that the timeline remained incomplete. It reminded the jury that the prosecution carried the burden of proof. Every doubt mattered. The prosecutor knew the defense had found the weakest part of the case. There was no eyewitness to the murder, no recovered weapon, no recording, no confession, no complete minute-by-minute timeline. The case was circumstantial. But circumstantial evidence can be powerful. It depends on how tightly the pieces connect. The prosecutor returned to the evidence. Laura's car, the biological material, the fibers, the calls, the note, the alibi, the damaged truck, the witness, the location, the timing. Then came the most important evidence, a second DNA result. Investigators had requested additional testing on another preserved sample. The laboratory had identified another male profile. It matched Mercer. The new sample came from a different piece of evidence, different location, same suspect. That mattered enormously. One DNA connection could be challenged. Two independent biological connections were much harder to explain. The defense objected again. The laboratory expert explained the result. The profiles were consistent. The probability of an unrelated individual producing the same profile was extraordinarily small. The defense asked about secondary transfer. Again, theoretically possible. But investigators now had multiple independent pieces of evidence placing Mercer in contact with Laura during the relevant period. The case had reached a point where coincidence required too many explanations. The jury listened. Mercer remained expressionless. For the family, every word was painful. They had spent decades imagining what might have happened. Now the details were being spoken aloud in a courtroom. The night Laura disappeared. The abandoned car. The isolated location. The evidence. The biological material. The years of silence. Then the prosecution introduced one final piece of evidence. A map. Not a modern map. A map reconstructed from 1984 road record. It showed Mercer's workplace, Laura's apartment, the location of the abandoned vehicle, the location where Laura was found, the route between them. Investigators calculated the travel time. Mercer could have made the entire journey within the relevant window. The defense argued that other people could have done the same. The prosecutor agreed, then asked a different question. How many of those people were connected to Laura? How many had been in contact with her? How many had given investigators an alibi that later became questionable? How many were connected to the specialized material? How many were connected to the DNA? The answer narrowed the field. The case was not about proving that nobody else could possibly have committed the murder. It was about proving whether the evidence established Mercer's responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial continued. Days became weeks. The media gathered outside. Old residents spoke about the case. Some remembered Laura. Others had forgotten. Some expressed shock that the investigation had survived so long. One retired detective said he had never expected to see an arrest. Another said the case had haunted investigators because the answer seemed close but unreachable. For the family, the attention was overwhelming. They had spent decades without cameras. Now cameras were everywhere. Every courtroom entrance became a news image. Every hearing became a headline. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained controlled. The evidence had to stand on its own. And as the final arguments approached, one question dominated everything. Was this finally enough? 38 years after Laura Bennett vanished into the darkness of Salem, Oregon, the answer would soon belong to 12 people sitting inside a courtroom. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars passed. People went to work. Rain fell against the windows. Life continued. But inside that courtroom, time had stopped at 1984. Laura was still 27. Her car was still sitting beneath the darkness. The old evidence was still sealed in its envelope. And the man accused of killing her was waiting for the verdict. For decades, the case had been a question. Now it was about to become a judgment. The courtroom doors opened just after 9 in the morning. Outside, reporters were already waiting. Cameras pointed toward the entrance. Microphones were held against the cold Oregon air. The story had become bigger than Salem. A woman murdered in 1984. A suspect identified nearly 4 decades later. Evidence preserved for generations. DNA technology bringing an old investigation back to life. But inside the courtroom, there was no television drama. There was only silence. Daniel Mercer sat beside his attorney. His hands were folded. His face was difficult to read. Across the room, Laura Bennett's family waited. They had spent 38 years waiting for this moment. 38 years of birthdays without her. 38 years of unanswered questions. 38 years of hearing the same phrase. The investigation remains open. Now the phrase was gone. The case was in court. And the evidence was finally being tested in public. The prosecution began its closing argument by returning to the beginning. Not to the DNA. Not to Mercer. To Laura. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Laura had left her apartment believing she would return. She had no reason to believe that night would be different from any other. She left behind the ordinary things people leave behind when they expect to come home. Her purse, personal belongings, plans, a future. Then she disappeared. Her vehicle was found abandoned. Her body was discovered days later, and the person responsible had remained unidentified for decades. The prosecutor paused. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere. The evidence never disappeared. The evidence had simply waited. The prosecutor displayed the original evidence envelope. Old, faded, marked with a number assigned in 1984, 117. Inside had been a tiny piece of synthetic material. At the time, investigators could not determine what it meant. They preserved it anyway. That decision became important 38 years later. Modern testing had identified characteristics consistent with material connected to Mercer's work. Then the biological evidence had been tested. A DNA profile. Mercer. Not a rumor. Not a memory. Not a theory. A forensic result. The defense had spent days explaining why the evidence might not mean what prosecutors believed it meant. Now the prosecutor answered those arguments one by one. Could DNA be transferred? Yes. Could people encounter each other innocently? Yes. Could a witness remember something incorrectly after 38 years? Yes. Could a fiber appear in a vehicle for an innocent reason? Yes. Could an old telephone record have another explanation? Yes. The prosecutor did not deny any of it. Instead, the argument became more direct. One coincidence could be explained. Two could be explained. Perhaps three. But when every independent piece pointed toward the same person, the jury had to consider the entire picture. The prosecutor placed the timeline on the screen. Laura leaves her apartment. Mercer is connected to her. Mercer claims he is working. A former supervisor remembers him leaving. A co-worker cannot confirm the alibi. A witness remembers a vehicle near Laura's apartment. The same vehicle later shows unexplained damage. Laura had written Mercer's name before her death. Specialized fibers connected to Mercer's work appear in evidence. Biological material connects Mercer to Laura. Additional DNA testing produces another matching result. The map shows Mercer could reach every relevant location during the critical period. The prosecutor stepped away from the screen. This is not one piece of evidence, she said. This is a chain. The defense stood next. The attorney's strategy was clear. Break the chain. The first attack focused on the DNA. The defense attorney reminded the jury that DNA could establish contact, but not intent. Mercer knew Laura. That was never disputed. He had worked near her apartment. He had spoken with her. They had known each other. Therefore, the presence of his DNA did not automatically prove murder. The defense then attacked the fibers. The material was associated with Mercer's occupation, but other workers had handled it. Other vehicles had carried it. The defense argued that the fibers could have been transferred during ordinary contact. Then came the witnesses. The defense questioned the woman who remembered the truck. She had been young in 1984. She had seen the vehicle briefly. She admitted she could not remember the license plate. She could not swear to the exact model. She remembered only the general shape and damaged taillight. The defense attorney asked whether she had seen photographs of Mercer's truck before giving her statement. She admitted investigators had shown her old photographs. That became a major point for the defense. Memory could be influenced. Memory could change. Memory could become contaminated by information learned later. The defense attorney looked toward the jury. 38 years is a long time. Nobody in the room could disagree. Then the defense attacked the mechanic. He remembered Mercer bringing the truck for repair, but the mechanic could not independently remember the exact night. The date came from the invoice. The defense argued that the invoice proved a repair. It did not prove why the repair was needed. It did not prove where the truck had been. It did not prove Laura had ever been inside it. Again, the defense was correct. The prosecution had no direct evidence connecting the truck to the murder, only circumstances. Then the defense turned toward the handwritten note. Laura's note. The name Mercer. 2 words. Ask why. The defense argued that the note was meaningless without context. Laura had written the name, but she had not written "he threatened me." She had not written "I am afraid." She had not written "Daniel did this." There was no direct accusation. The note could have referred to business, money, work, a personal disagreement, anything. The defense attorney held up the photograph of the note. Words without context are not proof of murder. The prosecutor did not object, because the argument was fair. The case had weaknesses. Everyone knew it. There was no eyewitness to the killing, no confession, no murder weapon, no video, no complete timeline. The prosecution was asking the jury to connect circumstances. The defense was asking them to doubt those connections. That was the entire battle. Not whether Mercer had known Laura. He had. Not whether his DNA was present. It was. Not whether his truck had been damaged. It had. Not whether his original alibi was questionable. It was. The question was whether those facts formed a sufficiently reliable picture of what happened. Then the prosecution made one final move. The medical examiner was recalled. The doctor had reviewed the original autopsy and modern forensic finding. The prosecutor asked about the biological material. The doctor explained where it had been recovered. The location was significant. The defense had described innocent transfer, but the location was not random. The biological material had been recovered from an area associated with the assault. The doctor explained that the evidence was consistent with direct contact, not absolute proof of the sequence, but strong evidence of contact under circumstances that required explanation. The defense objected to the interpretation. The judge allowed the testimony. The doctor continued. There was no evidence suggesting that the material had been deposited there through an unrelated event. The prosecution asked one final question. Is the evidence consistent with the conclusion that Mr. Mercer had physical contact with Miss Bennett during the events surrounding her death? The doctor answered carefully. Yes. The courtroom became silent. That single answer changed the weight of the DNA evidence. It was no longer merely a biological connection. It was evidence connected to the circumstances of the fatal encounter. The defense attorney stood again. He asked whether the doctor could determine the exact time of transfer. No. Could the doctor determine whether the contact was intentional? No. Could the doctor state that the DNA itself proved murder? No. The defense sat down. The limitations remained. But so did the evidence. The jury received the instruction. They were told that the burden belonged entirely to the prosecution. They were told that suspicion was not enough. They were told that they must reach a verdict based on evidence. Then they left. The courtroom doors closed. Laura's family remained seated. Mercer remained seated. The lawyers waited. Outside, reporters watched the hallway. Nobody knew how long deliberations would take. An hour. 6 hours. A day. Several days. The jury entered the deliberation room with a case nearly 4 decades old. Inside the room were photographs from 1984, evidence reports, DNA results, maps, witness testimony, the handwritten note, the old alibi, the new forensic analysis. The jurors began with the evidence. One juror reportedly focused immediately on the DNA. Another focused on the timeline. Another questioned the reliability of the old witnesses. The debate continued. There was no unanimous certainty at first. That was expected. A case this old was complicated. The jurors went through the evidence again. They requested clarification on the DNA testimony. They reviewed the timeline. They examined the photographs. The judge answered their questions. Then the jurors returned to deliberation. The defense waited. The prosecution waited. Laura's family waited. For the first time, the family was not waiting for an investigator to call. They were waiting for 12 strangers to decide whether the evidence was enough. Hours passed. The courthouse became quieter. The media coverage intensified. Every update became a headline. Breaking. Jury deliberates in 1984 Salem murder case. Then another. DNA evidence at center of decades-old homicide trial. The story had become national. People who had never heard Laura's name were now reading about her. But for her family, the headlines meant little. They knew her. They remembered her voice. They remembered her laugh. They remembered what was lost. The case was never really about the headline. It was about the empty space Laura left behind. The jury returned the following afternoon. The courtroom filled quickly. Mercer entered. The judge took the bench. Everyone stood, then sat. The clerk received the verdict form. The foreperson stood. The judge asked whether the jury had reached a unanimous decision. Yes. The room seemed to stop breathing. The first verdict was read. Guilty. There was no reaction from Mercer. The second charge was read. Guilty. The courtroom remained silent. Laura's mother lowered her head. Her brother closed his eyes. A relative reached across and held his hand. Nobody celebrated. There was relief. But it was mixed with grief. Because a guilty verdict could not return Laura. It could not erase 38 years. It could not give her the life she should have lived. It could only establish accountability. For the first time, the official record would contain an answer. Daniel Mercer was responsible for Laura Bennett's death. The judge ordered Mercer held pending sentence. The defense announced plans to appeal. The prosecution declined to call the case easy. It had never been easy. The case had survived because evidence had survived. The tiny fiber, the preserved biological material, the old records, the forgotten witness, the repair invoice, the telephone notes, the handwritten page. The pieces had existed independently for decades. No one piece had been enough. Together, they became a story. After the verdict, Laura's family left the courthouse. Reporters approached. Microphones appeared. Questions followed. How did they feel? What did the verdict mean? Did they finally have closure? Laura's brother stopped. He looked toward the courthouse. Then he answered quietly. Closure is a complicated word. He said the verdict mattered. He said accountability mattered. But he said 38 years could not be returned. That sentence stayed with everyone who heard it, because that was the real cost of the cold case. The killer had been identified. The courtroom had spoken. The evidence had done what investigators hoped it would do. A time had already taken everything it could take. Laura should have been 55 when the case was solved. Instead, she remained 27 forever. Her friends had aged. Her family had aged. The city had changed. The roads had changed. The buildings had changed. Technology had changed. But the murder remained exactly where it had always been. November 1984. A rainy night. A woman leaving her apartment. A car disappearing into darkness. A family waiting. And a small piece of evidence sitting quietly inside an envelope. For decades, that envelope meant almost nothing. Then science caught up with it. That is what made the case so haunting. The breakthrough did not come from a spectacular discovery at a fresh crime scene. It came from something investigators had already collected, something they had already cataloged, something they had already stored. The clue had been there. The entire time. It simply had not been readable. That realization changed the way Salem looked at old cases. Police departments began reviewing evidence from other unsolved murders. Families began asking whether forgotten evidence could be tested again. Cold cases that had seemed impossible suddenly looked different. Not solved, not guaranteed, but possible. Because technology does not erase the past. Sometimes it simply gives the past a voice. Laura's case became an example of that. A murder that survived 3 decades. A file that gathered dust. A name that disappeared from headlines. A suspect who believed time was protection. And evidence that refused to disappear. The final evidence log was updated. The old case number remained. The original date remained. The victim's name remained. But one word changed. Open. It was no longer written beside the case. The investigation had ended. The evidence had finally answered the question that had haunted Salem since 1984. Who killed Laura Bennett? The answer was Daniel Mercer. But another question remained. How many other cases were still waiting for their forgotten evidence to speak? How many envelopes were sitting in old evidence rooms? How many fibers? How many photographs? How many biological samples? How many fingerprints to damage for the technology of yesterday but readable by the technology of tomorrow? Nobody knew. That was the unsettling part. The past was still full of evidence. Somewhere, inside another forgotten box, another piece of a story could still be waiting. And somewhere, perhaps, another family was still waiting for a phone call, waiting for a name, waiting for someone to open an old file and look again. Because sometimes a cold case does not die. It waits. It waits through rain, through retirement, through new buildings, through new detectives, through generations. And sometimes, after decades of silence, a laboratory machine examines something that everyone else had forgotten. A tiny fiber, a microscopic stain, a damaged print, a fragment of DNA. And suddenly, the past moves. A name appears. A door opens. A suspect is found. And a mystery that once seemed destined to remain unsolved begins speaking again. For Laura Bennett, that moment came 38 years too late. But it came. And in Salem, Oregon, the old case finally stopped being a question. It became a record, a verdict, a name, a truth recovered from evidence that had been waiting in the dark. The verdict should have been the end. For most people, it was. The headlines moved on. The cameras disappeared from the courthouse steps. Reporters found newer stories. The courtroom emptied. Daniel Mercer was taken into custody. The legal process continued. But for the investigators who had reopened Laura Bennett's case, something still bothered them. The verdict had answered who. It had answered responsibility. But it had not answered every question. There were still missing hours. There were still unexplained movements. There were still details from 1984 that had never been fully reconstructed. And now that Mercer had been convicted, investigators had access to something they had never possessed before. His full history, his old statements, his movements, his relationships, his financial records, his employment records. Everything could be examined again, not because the conviction was in doubt, because the detectives wanted to understand how the case had remained unsolved for so long. The first question was simple. Why had Mercer not been caught in 1984? The answer was buried inside the original investigation. The first detectives had suspected him. They had questioned him. They had documented inconsistency. But the evidence had not been enough. Mercer had denied meeting Laura. He had denied being near her vehicle. He had denied knowing anything about her disappearance. His answers were confident, specific, detailed. And that detail had worked in his favor. Investigators believed his story was suspicious, but suspicion was not proof. Without biological evidence connecting him to the crime, there was no way to bridge the gap. That was the weakness. The case had a suspect. It did not have a case against the suspect. The distinction mattered. Mercer walked out of the police station in 1984. Laura remained dead. The file remained open. And the years began passing. The reopened investigation revealed something else. Mercer had changed his life shortly after Laura's death. He left Salem. He changed employers. He eventually moved out of Oregon. None of those actions were criminal. People move. People change jobs. People start over. But investigators now looked at the timing. Mercer left Salem within months of the murder. He did not disappear immediately. He remained in the area for a while. That made the departure less dramatic than it might have seemed. But the detectives noticed something. He had sold his truck, the same truck associated with the damaged taillight. The vehicle disappeared from his records. Investigators traced it. The truck had been sold to another man. That man was located. He was elderly. He remembered purchasing the vehicle. He did not know its history. He had used it for several years. Then he sold it again. The vehicle was eventually scrapped. Nothing remained. But the paper trail confirmed one thing. Mercer had gotten rid of the truck shortly after the murder. The defense had previously argued that the truck damage was meaningless. Now investigators understood why it had mattered. It was not proof by itself, but it was another unexplained event surrounding the same period. The detectives then revisited the phone calls. Laura had received several calls connected to a business Mercer had access to. The original investigators had never established who made those calls. Modern records could not recreate the conversation. But an old employee remembered Mercer using the phone repeatedly during the weeks before Laura's death. The employee had assumed Mercer was calling suppliers. He had no reason to think otherwise. But when investigators showed him Laura's name, his memory shifted. He remembered Mercer asking whether someone was at home. The employee could not remember exactly when, but he remembered the question. That mattered. It suggested Mercer may have been monitoring Laura's movements. Again, investigators had to be careful. A memory after 38 years was not perfect, but the new information fit the existing timeline. Mercer knew when Laura was home. He knew when she left. He knew where she lived. He had access to a phone connected to her, and he had been around her before the murder. The investigators then examined Laura's financial concern. This became one of the most disturbing discoveries. The contractor Mercer worked for had been involved in questionable billing. Laura's job gave her access to administrative information. She had noticed inconsistencies. She had asked questions. She had apparently kept notes. Investigators found copies of documents in her personal file. The documents showed unexplained payments. Some were connected to projects Mercer had worked on. The amounts were not enormous, but the pattern was unusual. Laura had begun tracking them. And then, shortly before her death, she had written Mercer's name. Ask why. That note suddenly looked different. Investigators could not prove Laura had planned to expose him, but the possibility was strong. Mercer may have believed Laura knew something that could threaten his job, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. The motive was no longer simply a theory about personal conflict. There was a possible financial reason, and that changed the investigation again. Detectives began reviewing the contractor's records. Several employees had left around the same period. One had been fired. Another had moved away. Another had died. The company itself no longer existed, but the archived financial records remained. They revealed discrepancies, payments that did not match invoices that had been altered, dates that did not align, names that appeared repeatedly. Mercer was not the only person involved. That became important. The murder might have been connected to more than one person. The detectives searched for anyone else who could have benefited from Laura's silence. Several names emerged, but none had the same connection to the physical evidence. None had the DNA. None had the questionable alibi. None had been placed near Laura's apartment that night. Mercer remained at the center. The detectives then returned to the crime scene, not the modern landscape, the 1984 landscape. They used archived aerial photographs, old property maps, road records, utility plans. They reconstructed the area as it had looked that night. The location where Laura was found had been darker and more isolated than it appeared today. There had been fewer homes, less traffic, fewer lights. A person could have driven there without attracting attention. That mattered. The killer did not need extraordinary planning. The geography itself provided protection. The detectives calculated travel times from Mercer's workplace, from Laura's apartment, from the abandoned vehicle, from the location where the body was found. The distances aligned. Mercer could have made the journey. That did not prove he did, but the timeline remained possible. Then investigators discovered something else. A former resident remembered hearing a vehicle late that night. The witness had been interviewed in 1984, but had never been asked about the sound. The person remembered a truck engine, a vehicle stopping briefly, then leaving. The witness could not identify the truck, but the timing matched the estimated window. The detective added the statement to the case reconstruction. The pattern was becoming remarkably consistent. A truck near Laura's apartment. A truck with a damaged taillight. Mercer connected to that truck. Mercer leaving work earlier than claimed. Mercer connected to Laura. Mercer's DNA on evidence from the fatal encounter. And a vehicle route consistent with the crime. The detectives could now explain much of the night. But one thing still bothered them. Laura's car. Why had Mercer left it where it was found? If he had killed Laura, why not hide the vehicle? Why abandon it in a location where police would eventually find it? The answer came from the physical evidence. The car had been left far enough from Laura's home to make the situation appear like a disappearance, but close enough to a traveled road that it would eventually be discovered. It created confusion. A missing person scenario. Perhaps an accident. Perhaps a voluntary departure. Perhaps a kidnapping. The vehicle had been part of the deception. That possibility became stronger when investigators realized something else. Laura's purse had been left inside. Her identification was there. Her keys were there. But one item was missing. A small notebook. Her family remembered it. Laura carried it almost everywhere. It contained work notes, phone numbers, appointments, personal reminders. It had never been recovered. The notebook was not inside her apartment. It was not in the car. It was not among her belongings. It was simply gone. Investigators believed it might have contained information about the financial irregularities. If Mercer had taken it, that could explain why, but there was no way to prove what had happened to the notebook. It remained missing. Then came another discovery. A former coworker remembered Laura saying she planned to meet someone that evening. She had not identified the person, But the coworker remembered Laura saying she needed to clear something up. The phrase had been ignored in 1984. Now it was important. The coworker was shown a list of names. When Mercer appeared, she recognized it immediately. She said Laura had mentioned him. The investigators asked why. The coworker remembered Laura saying Mercer had become difficult to deal with. She believed he was hiding something. Again, the statement did not prove murder, but it established that Laura's concerns about Mercer existed before the night she died. The detectives began to see a sequence. Laura discovers financial irregularities. She starts asking questions. She becomes concerned about Mercer. She communicates with him. She plans to meet someone. She leaves her apartment. She disappears. Mercer provides an alibi. The alibi weakens. Physical evidence links him to Laura. Then he leaves Salem. 38 years later, DNA confirms the connection. The pieces were no longer scattered. They formed a pattern. But there was one problem. The case was already solved. Mercer had been convicted. Why keep investigating? Because the investigators believed the truth deserved more than a verdict. They wanted to know whether someone else had been involved. They wanted to know what happened to the missing notebook. They wanted to know whether Mercer had acted alone. And they wanted to understand whether the financial scheme had played a direct role in the murder. They reopened interviews. Former employees were contacted. Old records were searched. The contractor's financial history was examined. One former employee provided a disturbing statement. He said Mercer had once warned him to stay away from Laura. The warning had happened weeks before the murder. The employee had thought it was a personal dispute. He had ignored it. Now he understood it differently. Mercer may have been trying to prevent Laura from asking questions. Another employee remembered a confrontation. Laura had allegedly challenged Mercer about missing documents. Mercer became angry. He told her she did not understand what she was looking at. The original investigation had never found this information. The reason was simple. The employees had been interviewed briefly. Nobody knew which questions would matter decades later. The detective who reopened the case realized how much had been lost in those early interviews, not because investigators had failed, because investigations are built on what people know at the time. In 1984, nobody knew which details would become important. In 2022, investigators could see the entire picture. That is the strange power of cold cases. Time can destroy evidence. But time can also reveal patterns. Records that once seemed unrelated become connected. A name appearing in one document becomes meaningful when it appears in another. A forgotten witness becomes important when modern forensic evidence points in the same direction. A fiber becomes valuable when science can finally identify its characteristic. And a decades-old DNA sample can suddenly turn a suspect into a defendant. The investigators continued digging. Then they found a document that changed the motive. It was a financial statement. Mercer had received an unexplained payment shortly before Laura's death. The amount was small, but it came from an account associated with the contract. The payment was not documented properly. Mercer had never mentioned it. Investigators compared it with the financial irregularities Laura had been examining. The connection was not conclusive, but it was troubling. A second payment appeared, then another. The amounts were different. The dates were different, but the same names kept appearing. Mercer, the contractor, the questionable invoices, Laura's notes. Suddenly, the murder appeared to have a possible financial background. The detectives believed Laura may have discovered something she intended to confront Mercer about. And that could explain why she left home willingly. She may have believed she was meeting someone to discuss a problem. She may have expected an argument. She may have expected an explanation. She did not expect death. That possibility made the case more disturbing. The killer may not have needed to lure Laura into danger. He may simply have convinced her that he wanted to talk. That was enough. A familiar face. A familiar vehicle. A familiar voice. A simple conversation. Then everything changed. The investigators now believed Laura's trust had been the weapon. Not a gun. Not a knife. Not force at the beginning. Trust. The same trust that allowed her to enter a vehicle without fear. The same trust that allowed her to meet someone at night. The same trust that gave the killer access to her. And that realization brought the case back to its most haunting detail. Laura's final confirmed sighting. She was not running. She was not screaming. She was not fighting. She was simply leaving. She believed she would return. She did not know that she was walking into the final hour of her life. For decades, that moment had been frozen inside the investigation. Now detectives understood what might have happened next, but they still had one final mystery: the missing notebook. If Laura had written down what she knew, where had it gone? And if Mercer had taken it, what had he done with it? Investigators searched every surviving record connected to Mercer: storage units, property records, old addresses, employment files. They searched for anything that could have survived. Most searches produced nothing. Then an investigator found a reference to an old storage facility. Mercer had rented a unit shortly after leaving Salem. The rental records were incomplete, but the facility still existed. The unit was long gone. Its contents had been sold decades earlier, yet the manager's ledger survived. Mercer's name was there. The rental began weeks after Laura's murder. The unit remained active for several months. Then it was emptied. Nobody knew what had been inside. Nobody knew who had emptied it. The missing notebook could have been there, or it could have been something completely unrelated. There was no way to know. But the investigators had learned something from Laura's case. A clue did not have to be dramatic to matter. Sometimes it was a name, sometimes a date, sometimes a forgotten invoice, sometimes a box that nobody had opened for 38 years. The case had already produced a conviction, but the search for the complete truth continued. And as investigators went deeper into Mercer's past, they discovered that Laura may not have been the only person who had become suspicious of him. Another woman had raised questions about the same financial records. She had left the company shortly afterward. She had moved away. And when investigators finally located her, she remembered something that made the detectives stop. She had been afraid of Daniel Mercer, not because he had threatened her directly, because of something he had said. A sentence, a warning, a statement she had never forgotten. And suddenly, the murder of Laura Bennett looked less like an isolated act. It looked like the final consequence of a secret that had been growing for months. A secret involving money. A secret involving documents. A secret Laura had begun uncovering. And a man who had every reason to want those questions to stop. The old cold case had been solved. But the deeper investigators went, the more they realized the murder itself might have been only the visible surface of a much larger story. And beneath that story was another mystery. How much had Laura discovered before she died? And how much had Daniel Mercer spent 38 years trying to bury?